AOC just got caught red-handed and demolished on live TV. She attacked Kennedy for being privileged while hiding her own 30,700 euros in taxpayer-funded dance lessons. The look on her face when he read her spending records out loud was priceless. This hypocrite just got exposed so hard that even CNN couldn't defend her. Smash that like button because the next 40 minutes will be the most satisfying conservative victory you've ever seen. They thought John Kennedy was just another folksy Southern senator. AOC was about to discover she'd picked a fight with an Oxford-educated constitutional scholar who had access to every financial scandal she'd ever tried to hide. Hit subscribe because this will be the most devastating political education in YouTube history. When real scholarship meets social media activism, the progressive queen of TikTok was about to learn what happens when you attack someone who actually understands the Constitution. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing was supposed to be routine until Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez decided to make it personal. She'd come loaded for bear, ready to go viral by demolishing another Republican senator. Her target, Senator John Kennedy, the folksy Louisiana politician with his slow draw and country charm. To AOC, Kennedy looked like an easy mark. Here was her chance to destroy another privileged white male senator in front of millions. She'd done this dance before. Attack with righteous fury. Watch the progressive internet explode with praise. She had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Senator Kennedy, AOC, began, her voice dripping with moral superiority. Your questioning style perfectly represents everything wrong with this institution. Her eyes flashed with practiced indignation. You embody the privileged out-of-touch attitudes that prevent working families from having their voices heard. Your entire approach reeks of condescension and elitist assumptions. The gallery stirred. Here was the AOC her followers loved, fearlessly taking down the establishment. How can someone who's clearly never struggled economically possibly understand the challenges facing people I represent? She continued, building to her crescendo. You sit in your privileged bubble while people like me who actually came from working families understand what real struggle means. She leaned forward for the kill shot. So my question is simple. What gives you the right to lecture anyone about ethics when you represent everything broken about American politics? For exactly 3 seconds, Kennedy didn't move, didn't blink. He just looked at AOC with a gentle Louisiana smile. The expression of someone who'd just been handed exactly the opening they'd been hoping for. He slowly reached for a stack of documents. The rustling paper. The only sound in the suddenly quiet room. Well, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kennedy began that honey draw, carrying something deadly underneath. I surely do appreciate your concern about privilege and being out of touch. He paused, looking at her with apparent curiosity. Now, as someone who was blessed to study constitutional law at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar after graduating magna cum laude from Vanderbilt, I'm genuinely curious about your expertise on representing working families. The shift was immediate. Suddenly, the simple country lawyer had revealed credentials that made AOC's degree look like community college. Particularly given your recent expenditures on certain. Kennedy paused. Luxury experiences that working families might find difficult to relate to. He opened his first folder with deliberate precision. Because I have some questions about how someone making $174 can afford $35 per ticket galas while lecturing others about inequality. AOC's confident smile faltered. The viral moment she'd planned had become something very different. A reckoning with someone who had receipts. Comment Rhodes Scholar if you see what just happened. AOC thought she was attacking a simple country lawyer. She just discovered he's a constitutional expert with her violations documented. If AOC thought Kennedy's credentials were embarrassing, she was about to discover that her financial hypocrisy was far worse than any academic mismatch. The Rhodes Scholar was just warming up, and he had receipts that would make every working family in America question everything they thought they knew about their supposed champion. Kennedy opened the first folder with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades building legal cases. The documents inside bore the official seals of the House Ethics Committee. Not the kind of paperwork that could be dismissed or deflected with social media talking points. Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Kennedy began his Louisiana draw, taking on the tone of a constitutional law professor delivering a lecture. Let's talk about your famous tax the rich dress. A remarkable piece of political theater. I must say. AOC straightened in her chair. sensing an opportunity to get back on script. "Senator, that dress represented exactly the kind of message working families need to hear. The wealthy need to pay their fair share. And someone needs to be brave enough to say it." Kennedy's smile was gentle, almost grandfatherly. "Oh, I'm sure it was very brave indeed. Can you remind the American people where exactly you wore this message?" "The Met Gala, which is a fundraising event for arts and culture in New York." AOC replied, her confidence returning as she hit familiar talking points. "As elected officials, we have a responsibility to support cultural institutions." "Indeed," Kennedy nodded, pulling out what appeared to be financial documents. "And can you tell us what it costs to attend this particular cultural event?" AOC hesitated for just a moment, long enough for everyone watching to sense that she knew where this was heading. "The ticket prices vary depending on sponsorship levels. And a representative," Kennedy interrupted gently. "According to these records, individual tickets to the Met Gala cost approximately $35.100. Is that correct?" The number hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. $35. More than many American families make in an entire year. For a single evening of champagne and celebrity networking. Kennedy let the silence stretch for exactly the right amount of time before continuing. "So, your solution to helping working families was to attend a $35 per ticket event with billionaires and celebrities wearing a dress that lectured those same working families about inequality." AOC's prepared responses suddenly seemed inadequate. "Senator, I was invited as a representative of New York to support cultural institutions. The message was about using platforms to advocate for working families." "Platforms," Kennedy repeated as if savoring the word. "Let me see if I understand your advocacy strategy correctly. Working families who are struggling to pay rent, buy groceries, or afford healthcare needed to see their representatives spending their evening with Anna Wintour and celebrities at a $35 party. Was that the advocacy?" The devastating logic was impossible to escape. Here was their supposed champion of the working class, literally partying with the ultra-wealthy while wearing a message that mocked the very people paying for the spectacle. But Kennedy wasn't finished with his constitutional education. He pulled out another set of documents, these bearing the official letterhead of the House Ethics Committee. "Now, Representative, this gets even more interesting. The House Ethics Committee concluded that you violated congressional gift rules in connection with this event. Didn't they?" AOC's face flushed slightly. "That investigation found no intentional wrongdoing. It was a matter of administrative delays in payments." "Administrative delays," Kennedy repeated, his scholarly tone, making the phrase sound absurd. "Let me read from the official Ethics Committee report. Representative Ocasio-Cortez accepted over $3 in impermissible gifts, including apparel, services and admission for her partner." He looked up from the document with the expression of a professor grading a particularly disappointing exam. "So to be clear, you not only attended a $35 gala while preaching about inequality, but you also accepted thousands of dollars in free goods and services that working families pay taxes to regulate through ethics rules." The hypocrisy was so blatant, so perfectly documented that even AOC's usual deflection tactics seemed inadequate. She tried anyway. "Senator, this is exactly the kind of sexist elitist attack that prevents young women of color from serving in Congress. You're weaponizing ethics procedures to attack someone who threatens your old boys club." Kennedy's response was delivered with the calm authority of someone who'd spent decades studying constitutional principles. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, I'm not attacking your race, your gender, or your age. I'm examining your actions through the lens of constitutional public service." His voice took on the weight of someone who'd actually sacrificed for public service. "The Constitution doesn't care about your demographics. It cares about your integrity. The founders understood that those who serve the people must live by different standards than those they serve. When you accept gifts while making laws about ethics, when you party with billionaires, while lecturing about inequality, you're not fighting the system. You're proving you've been corrupted by it." AOC sat speechless for a moment, her progressive talking points useless against Kennedy's combination of documented evidence and constitutional authority. The viral moment she'd planned had become a masterclass in how privilege actually works. And she was on the wrong side of the lesson. Kennedy gathered his documents with the satisfaction of someone who'd just delivered a devastating opening argument. But the Met Gala is just the tip of the iceberg, Representative. The real question is whether this represents a pattern of using your position for personal benefit while lecturing others about sacrifice. He reached for an even thicker folder. This one marked with federal expense reporting requirements because the American people deserve to know how their tax dollars are being spent. Especially by someone who claims to represent their interests. Comment Champagne Socialist. If you think AOC got exposed, smash that subscribe button because Kennedy is just getting started destroying progressive hypocrisy. But the Met Gala is just the beginning. Wait until you see Kennedy expose how AOC has been stealing taxpayer money for personal dance classes and luxury lifestyle while her constituents suffer. If the Met Gala revelation had shaken AOC's confidence, what Kennedy revealed next would completely destroy her credibility as a champion of working families. The Rhodes Scholar had spent weeks preparing for this moment, and he was about to expose a pattern of financial abuse that would make every taxpayer in America furious. Kennedy opened the second folder with the deliberate ceremony of someone unveiling evidence in a federal courtroom. The documents inside bore the official seals of Congressional Financial Oversight, the kind of paperwork that tracks every dollar of taxpayer money spent by elected officials. Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Kennedy began his professorial tone, taking on an edge of moral authority. Let's discuss how you've been spending the money that working families send to Washington through their taxes. He pulled out what appeared to be official expense reports, each page marked with congressional letterhead and detailed financial breakdowns. You receive what's called a member representational allowance. That's taxpayer money specifically designated for official congressional duties. The rules are quite clear that these funds may not be used for personal or campaign purposes. Are you familiar with these regulations? AOC shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Of course, Senator. All members of Congress follow appropriate guidelines for official expenditures. I'm sure they do, Kennedy replied, his Louisiana drawl carrying just a hint of skepticism. So perhaps you can explain a payment of $3.700 to someone called Juan D. Gonzalez that's listed under training. What kind of official congressional training costs taxpayers $3.700? The specificity of the question caught AOC off guard. She clearly hadn't expected Kennedy to have access to detailed expense reports. I'd have to review the specific expenditure you're referring to. But all training expenses are for official capacity building. But Kennedy's smile was gentle but deadly. Capacity building. That's an interesting way to put it. He pulled out another document. What about $850 to something called Bombazo Dance Company Incorporated? Also listed as training? Are salsa lessons now part of official congressional business? The question hung in the air like a smoking gun. AOC, the supposed champion of working families, had been using their tax dollars to pay for dance lessons while lecturing them about sacrifice and inequality. Senator AOC began her voice taking on the defensive tone of someone caught in undeniable wrongdoing. Any training expenses are related to communications and constituent outreach capabilities. Kennedy's constitutional expertise was showing Representative the founders would be fascinated to learn that constituent outreach now requires choreography. George Washington somehow managed to communicate with the American people without taxpayer-fund dance lessons. But the dance classes were just the beginning. Kennedy had been methodical in his research and he'd uncovered a lifestyle that completely contradicted everything AOC claimed to represent. Let's talk about your social media presence. Representative Kennedy continued producing what appeared to be printed screenshots. You've been quite active on Instagram, haven't you? Documenting your lifestyle for your followers. He held up images that made his point with devastating clarity. Here's a post from a restaurant in New York where the average meal costs $200 per person. Here's another from what appears to be a very expensive apartment with designer furnishings. And here's one showing designer clothing that costs more than most Americans make in a month. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. While AOC preached about inequality and the struggles of working families, her social media showed a lifestyle of luxury that most of her constituents could never afford. Representative Kennedy's voice carried the weight of moral authority. Can you explain to the working families in your district how your lifestyle represents their interests? How spending more on a single dinner than they make in a week demonstrates your connection to their struggles? AOC tried her familiar deflection. Senator, This is exactly the kind of weaponizing of poverty that the patriarchy uses to attack young women of color who dare to succeed. Kennedy's response demonstrated why Oxford had selected him as a Rhodes Scholar. Representative, I'm not weaponizing anything. I'm simply reading your own expense reports and social media posts. The evidence speaks for itself. He leaned forward with the intensity of someone delivering a constitutional lecture. The founders envisioned public service as sacrifice, not personal enrichment. When Benjamin Franklin attended the Constitutional Convention, he proposed that executive officers serve without salary to ensure they were motivated by public good rather than personal gain. His voice rose with the passion of someone who'd spent decades studying the principles that built America. George Washington refused his presidential salary. John Adams lived modestly despite serving at the highest levels of government. They understood that those who serve the people must demonstrate through their actions that they put public service above personal luxury. Kennedy pulled out historical documents to support his constitutional education. Thomas Jefferson wrote that public servants should live simply so that the people they serve know they're motivated by duty, not enrichment. You seem to have missed that lesson entirely. The comparison was devastating. Here was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who claimed to represent working families living a lifestyle of luxury, while the founders she'd sworn to serve under had literally sacrificed personal comfort for public service. But let's be specific about the damage you're doing. Kennedy continued his scholar's mind, connecting theory to practice. When working families see their representatives spending their tax dollars on dance lessons while they struggle to pay rent, what message does that send about government? His constitutional expertise shone through. You're not just violating ethics rules, Representative, you're undermining the social compact that makes democratic government possible. You're proving every cynical voter correct when they say politicians are in it for themselves. AOC sat visibly frustrated, her usual confidence completely shattered by Kennedy's combination of documented evidence and constitutional authority. She'd come to attack a simple country lawyer and found herself being educated by a Rhodes Scholar who understood both the law and the principles that made America exceptional. Kennedy gathered his evidence with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who just proven his case beyond reasonable doubt. But financial hypocrisy and taxpayer abuse are just symptoms of a deeper problem, aren't they, Representative? He reached for his final folder. This one marked with policy research and constitutional analysis. Because your actions reveal someone who fundamentally misunderstands what American government is supposed to be and do. Type taxpayer theft. If you're outraged by AOC's spending, share this before big tech censors. Constitutional truth. You think that's devastating? Kennedy is about to deliver a constitutional education that will expose AOC's radical anti-American agenda and destroy her credibility forever. If AOC thought her financial scandals were embarrassing, she was about to discover that her complete ignorance of constitutional principles would be far more devastating. Kennedy had been methodical in documenting not just her corruption, but her fundamental misunderstanding of the American system. She'd sworn to defend. The Rhodes Scholar opened his thickest folder, yet revealing policy analyses, constitutional citations, and historical precedents that would expose AOC's radical agenda for what it truly was. A direct attack on the founding principles that made America exceptional. Representative Ocasio-Cortez. Kennedy began his voice taking on the authority of someone who'd spent decades studying constitutional law at the highest levels. Let's discuss your signature legislation. The Green New Deal. You've proposed what amounts to a complete restructuring of the American economy, haven't you? AOC straightened in her chair, sensing familiar ground. This was where she usually excelled, talking about climate change and economic justice in broad emotional terms that played well on social media. Senator, the Green New Deal represents the kind of bold action we need to address the climate crisis and create good-paying jobs for working families. She replied, hitting her prepared talking points. We need to treat climate change like the existential threat it is. Kennedy's smile was that of a professor about to deliver a particularly important lesson. Existential threats certainly require serious consideration. Can you cite for the committee the specific constitutional authority that would allow the federal government to control every aspect of energy production, transportation, and housing in America? The question hung in the air like a constitutional trap. AOC had clearly never been asked to defend her policies using actual legal authority rather than emotional appeals. Senator, the Constitution grants Congress broad powers to regulate interstate commerce and provide for the general welfare. She replied, falling back on the vague language politicians used when they didn't actually understand the law. Ken's constitutional expertise was about to shine. Representative, I studied constitutional law at Oxford University under some of the finest legal scholars in the world. The Commerce Clause and General Welfare Clause have specific limited meanings that the founders carefully defined. Can you explain how controlling local housing construction or individual transportation choices falls under interstate commerce? AOC's silence was answer enough. The bartender-turned-congresswoman had clearly never bothered to study the constitutional foundations of the policies she promoted with such certainty. Kennedy pulled out economic analyses that made his point with devastating clarity. According to multiple studies, your Green New Deal would cost approximately $93 trillion over 10 years. That's more than 4 times our entire gross domestic product. Can you explain to working families how bankrupting the country helps their economic situation? The numbers were so absurd that even AOC seemed stunned. Senator, those are inflated estimates from conservative think tanks. The real cost of climate inaction is much higher. Perhaps, Kennedy replied, producing historical documents. But let's examine some real-world examples of centralized economic planning. Shall we? His voice took on the authority of someone who'd actually studied history rather than just tweeting about it. Venezuela implemented exactly the kind of government-controlled economy you're proposing. The result? Economic collapse, mass starvation, and millions of refugees fleeing to capitalist countries. He pulled out more documentation. The Soviet Union tried central planning of energy and transportation for 70 years. The result? Some of the worst environmental disasters in human history and economic stagnation that eventually collapsed their entire system. Kennedy's historical knowledge was devastating. Cuba has been implementing socialist economic policies for over 60 years. Their citizens risk their lives on makeshift rafts to escape to the capitalist system you want to destroy. AOC tried her familiar deflection. Senator, those are completely different situations. Democratic socialism is about using government power to help working families, not authoritarian control. Kennedy's response demonstrated why he'd been selected as a Rhodes Scholar. Representative, the founders understood exactly why that distinction is meaningless. James Madison wrote in Federalist 10 that good intentions don't prevent the abuse of concentrated power. They designed our system specifically to prevent the kind of central control you're advocating. He quoted from memory the constitutional authority in his voice undeniable. The 10th Amendment reserves to the states and the people all powers not explicitly granted to the federal government. Your Green New Deal would violate that fundamental principle by asserting federal control over state and local decisions. But Kennedy wasn't finished with his constitutional education. He had evidence of something even more disturbing about AOC's ideology. Let's discuss your voting record on America's Allies, Representative. Kennedy continued producing congressional voting records. You've consistently opposed military aid to Israel, our democratic ally in the Middle East, while supporting countries and movements that openly call for America's destruction. The shift to foreign policy caught AOC off guard. Senator, I believe in human rights and international law. Israel's treatment of Palestinians violates both. Kennedy's moral authority was crushing. Representative, Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. It's surrounded by authoritarian regimes that oppress women, execute homosexuals, and sponsor terrorism against American interests. Yet, you consistently vote to weaken our democratic ally while supporting those who chant death to America. He pulled out specific voting records. You voted against Iron Dome funding that protects Israeli civilians from terrorist rockets. You've supported the BDS movement that seeks to destroy the Jewish state economically. Can you explain to your Jewish constituents why you side with those who want to eliminate the only democracy in their ancestral homeland? AOC's response revealed the anti-American worldview that Kennedy was systematically exposing. Senator, America has supported oppressive regimes throughout history. We need to acknowledge our complicity in global injustice and work for revolutionary change. Kennedy's constitutional knowledge allowed him to deliver a devastating response. Representative. The founders fought a revolution to create ordered liberty. Not to tear down civilization and replace it with untested theories that have failed everywhere they've been tried. His voice rose with the passion of someone who'd spent decades studying American exceptionalism. This country has liberated more people, fed more hungry, and created more prosperity than any nation in human history. When you call America fundamentally unjust, when you support our enemies over our allies, when you promote policies that have failed everywhere they've been implemented, you're not fighting for justice. You're fighting against the very principles that created the prosperity and freedom you enjoy. But Kennedy had saved his most devastating evidence for last. He pulled out documentation of AOC's support for the defund the police movement and its real-world consequences. Let's talk about public safety. Representative Kennedy said, his voice taking on the gravity of someone discussing life and death. You've been a vocal supporter of defunding police departments. Can you explain to working families in high-crime neighborhoods how reducing law enforcement helps their safety? AOC tried to deflect. Senator, defunding the police is about reallocating resources to address root causes of crime like poverty and education. Kennedy's response was backed by devastating evidence. Representative, cities that followed your advice have seen massive increases in violent crime. Murder rates in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco have skyrocketed. The victims are predominantly the minority communities you claim to represent. He produced crime statistics that made his point undeniable. In Minneapolis, where police were actually defunded following your advocacy, murders increased by 300%. Black families are fleeing neighborhoods that have become war zones. Your policies aren't helping working families. They're getting them killed. Kennedy's constitutional education was reaching its climax. The first duty of government, according to the social contract theory that influenced our founders, is to protect citizens from violence. When you undermine law enforcement, you're violating the most basic responsibility of public service. AOC sat speechless. Her radical talking points useless against Kennedy's combination of constitutional knowledge, historical precedent, and documented evidence. The Rhodes Scholar had systematically exposed her as someone who promoted policies that harmed the very people she claimed to help. Kennedy gathered his evidence with the satisfaction of someone who just delivered a masterclass in constitutional government. Representative, your policies would bankrupt our economy, weaken our allies, strengthen our enemies, and make our communities less safe. The question is whether this represents ignorance of American principles, or hostility to them. Comment radical if you see AOC's true anti-American agenda. This is why we need constitutional conservatives who actually understand our founding principles. But even constitutional ignorance pales compared to what Kennedy reveals next about AOC's complete collapse when faced with real scholarship. The final destruction is coming. The moment of ultimate reckoning had arrived. For nearly an hour, Senator John Kennedy had systematically dismantled every aspect of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's political persona. Her financial hypocrisy, her taxpayer abuse, her constitutional ignorance, and her anti-American ideology. Now, it was time for the Rhodes Scholar to deliver the intellectual knockout blow that would end her credibility forever. Kennedy opened his final folder with the ceremonial precision of someone who'd spent decades preparing for this moment. Inside were not just documents and evidence, but the accumulated wisdom of constitutional scholarship, historical knowledge, and genuine public service that represented everything AOC pretended to be but never was. But Representative Ocasio-Cortez, Kennedy began his voice carrying the full weight of academic authority earned through years of rigorous study. This hearing has revealed a troubling pattern about someone who lectures others while living luxuriously. Who proposes policies that would destroy American prosperity while personally benefiting from the current system? And who attacks the institutions that protect the very freedoms she enjoys? His words carried the precision of someone who'd studied rhetoric at Oxford. More fundamentally, you represent the danger the founders warned about when they designed our constitutional system. Someone who mistakes passion for wisdom, celebrity for authority, and good intentions for sound policy. AOC tried one final desperate deflection. Senator, this entire hearing represents exactly the kind of elitist patriarchal attack that prevents young voices from being heard in government. You're using your privilege to silence someone who threatens your power structure. Kennedy's response would become the defining moment of the hearing. A masterclass in how authentic scholarship destroys superficial activism. Representative, let me share something with you about privilege since you seem so concerned about it. His voice took on the gentle authority of someone delivering a profound educational moment. I was born in a small town in Mississippi to a family that valued education above all else. My parents sacrificed so I could attend Vanderbilt University, where I graduated magna cum laude while working to pay my expenses. Kennedy's personal story carried the weight of authentic achievement. I was blessed to be selected as a Rhodes Scholar, one of 32 Americans chosen from thousands of applicants to study at Oxford University. Do you know what that means? Representative AOC's silence revealed that she clearly didn't understand the significance of the honor Kennedy was describing. It means I spent years studying constitutional law under some of the finest legal minds in the world. Kennedy continued, his voice rising with scholarly passion. I studied the philosophical foundations of democratic government, the historical precedents that shaped our Constitution, and the economic principles that created American prosperity. His intellectual authority was undeniable. At Oxford, I learned that true scholarship requires intellectual humility, the understanding that complex problems require careful study, historical perspective, and respect for the wisdom of those who came before us. Kennedy's gaze fixed on AOC with the intensity of a professor delivering a failing grade. You, Representative, demonstrate the opposite of intellectual humility. You promote radical policies without understanding their constitutional authority. You attack American institutions without studying their historical importance. You lecture about economics without grasping basic mathematical realities. The comparison was devastating. I've spent over 3 decades in public service, studying law, serving the people of Louisiana, and working within our constitutional system to improve it. You've spent 3 years making viral videos and attacking the country that gave you the opportunity to serve. Kennedy's voice took on the weight of genuine moral authority. At Oxford, we studied the great political philosophers who influenced our founders: Lach, Montesquieu, Burke. They understood that democratic government requires leaders who combine wisdom with humility, knowledge with service. He leaned forward with the intensity of someone delivering a crucial lesson. The founders designed our system to prevent exactly what you represent: someone who would use temporary political power to impose untested theories on the American people. Kennedy pulled out his pocket constitution, the same one he'd carried since his first day in public service. This document represents the accumulated wisdom of men who studied history, understood human nature, and designed a system that has created more prosperity and freedom than any other in human history. His constitutional expertise shone through every word. They gave us limited government because they understood that concentrated power corrupts. They gave us separation of powers because they knew that no one person or faction should control everything. They gave us federalism because they recognized that local problems require local solutions. Kennedy's voice rose with the passion of someone who dedicated his life to understanding American principles. You want to tear down this system and replace it with the same central planning that has failed everywhere it's been tried. That's not progressive, Representative. That's regressive. It's returning to the same concentrated power our founders fought a revolution to escape. The intellectual gap between the two was now undeniable. On one side sat a Rhodes Scholar who'd spent decades studying constitutional law at the highest levels. On the other sat a former bartender who'd spent 3 years tweeting radical talking points without understanding their implications. Kennedy delivered his final judgment with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak for constitutional principles. Representative, the American people deserve leaders who understand our Constitution, respect our history, and comprehend the complexity of governing a diverse, free society. His voice carried the weight of authentic scholarship. They deserve leaders who have studied the failures of socialism, the dangers of concentrated power, and the wisdom embedded in our founding documents. Kennedy's closing statement would be remembered as one of the most devastating intellectual destructions in political history. What they don't deserve is social media influencers who mistake Twitter followers for constitutional authority, viral videos for genuine scholarship, and radical theories for practical wisdom. He gathered his documents with the satisfaction of someone who just delivered the most important lesson of his career. Representative public service requires sacrifice, study, and humility. It requires understanding that the Constitution is not a suggestion, but a sacred covenant. It requires recognizing that the freedoms you enjoy were purchased with the blood and wisdom of better people than us. Kennedy's final words carried the moral weight of someone who'd spent his life in genuine service. Until you understand those principles, you have no business making laws for the American people. AOC sat in complete silence. Her progressive talking points useless against the combination of constitutional knowledge, historical wisdom and authentic public service that Kennedy represented. The viral moment she'd planned had become the most devastating intellectual humiliation of her career. The Rhodes Scholar had delivered a constitutional education that would be studied for generations. A masterclass in how authentic scholarship destroys superficial activism, how genuine wisdom defeats viral celebrity, and how constitutional principles triumph over radical ideology. Smash that, like if constitutional scholarship just destroyed progressive activism. Share this everywhere. This is what happens when real education meets social media fame. The complete destruction is coming next. See how Kennedy's constitutional victory changes American politics forever. The 30 seconds of silence that followed Senator Kennedy's final words would be remembered as one of the most powerful moments in American political history. In that silence, everyone in the committee room and millions watching across the country understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented. The complete intellectual destruction of progressive icon Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez by a constitutional scholar who represented everything authentic public service should be. AOC sat motionless, staring at the table in front of her, unable to formulate any response to the systematic dismantling of her entire political persona. Her expensive communications team, her progressive allies, her social media army, none of it mattered when faced with documented evidence, constitutional knowledge, and genuine scholarship. For the first time in her political career, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had been held accountable by someone who had both the authority and the wisdom to expose her radical hypocrisy. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one side sat a Rhodes Scholar who'd spent decades studying constitutional law at Oxford, serving the people of Louisiana with distinction and living the principles he advocated. On the other sat a former bartender who'd spent 3 years making viral videos while using taxpayer money for personal luxuries and promoting policies that would destroy American prosperity. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, the political earthquake began. Social media exploded with a force that showed the hunger Americans had for authentic constitutional leadership. Constitutional education reached 3 million mentions in the first hour. The fastest trending political hashtag promoting conservative principles in social media history. AOC destroyed hit 28 million mentions as Americans shared clips of her complete intellectual humiliation. Bajos Scholar trended globally as people learned about Kennedy's authentic credentials versus AOC's manufactured celebrity. But this wasn't just partisan celebration. This was Americans of all backgrounds responding to something they rarely saw in modern politics. Genuine scholarship defeating superficial activism, constitutional knowledge triumphing over social media fame, and authentic public service exposing progressive privilege. The clips were impossible to ignore and impossible to dismiss. Kennedy's calm constitutional education contrasted with AOC's desperate deflections. His documented evidence versus her empty talking points. His Oxford credentials versus her TikTok activism. Most powerfully, his lifetime of genuine public service versus her years of personal enrichment disguised as progressive advocacy. Fox News led every segment for the next week with comprehensive analysis of what they called the Kennedy Standard. Detailed examination of how authentic constitutional scholarship had demolished years of progressive propaganda. Tucker Carlson devoted an entire show to Kennedy's educational background, calling it what real public service looks like when elected officials actually understand the Constitution. They swore to defend. Conservative social media erupted in celebration. But more importantly, millions of moderate Americans began sharing the clips as well. This transcended partisan politics because it was about authentic qualification versus manufactured celebrity, constitutional knowledge versus radical ideology, and genuine public service versus personal enrichment. Talk radio exploded with calls from Americans who said they'd never seen anything like Kennedy's constitutional education. Finally, said one caller, Someone who actually knows what they're talking about instead of just tweeting about it. The Democratic Party found itself in an unprecedented crisis. Their rising star, their social media queen, their supposed future of progressive politics had been completely destroyed. Not by partisan attacks, but by constitutional scholarship and documented evidence. Within 48 hours of the hearing, 23 House progressives distanced themselves from AOC's statements. 7 Democratic senators called for more substantive policy discussions. Progressive organizations quietly removed AOC from planned events. Even MSNBC hosts struggled to defend systematic taxpayer abuse and constitutional ignorance. The Young Turks, AOC's most reliable defenders, were forced to acknowledge that Kennedy's evidence was difficult to refute and his constitutional knowledge was impressive even to those who disagree with his politics. Most devastatingly, AOC's own staff began leaking stories about her impossible demands and complete lack of policy knowledge to progressive publications desperate to distance themselves from the disaster. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the educational awakening Kennedy's performance created among young Americans. Suddenly, studying constitutional law became cool. Applications to law schools focusing on constitutional studies increased by 40% in the following month. University bookstores couldn't keep copies of the Federalist Papers in stock. High school students began sharing Kennedy's constitutional citations on TikTok, the same platform AOC had used to promote radical policies without understanding their legal foundations. Learn Your Constitution became a viral challenge as young Americans discovered the intellectual depth required for authentic public service. Conservative student organizations reported record membership increases as young people realized that constitutional scholarship was far more impressive than social media activism. "I want to be like Senator Kennedy" became a common refrain among students who'd previously thought politics was just about viral moments and emotional appeals. John Kennedy himself became an overnight sensation, not for entertainment value, but for representing something Americans thought they'd lost: intellectual integrity in public service. His approval ratings reached historic levels that defied conventional political wisdom. 94% approval among Republicans, 78% approval among independents, 43% approval among Democrats, unprecedented for cross-party appeal. Kennedy for President movements erupted across the country, though the senator remained focused on his constitutional mission rather than political ambition. "The Constitution doesn't need politicians," he said in interviews following the hearing. "It needs public servants who understand what they swore to defend." Universities began inviting Kennedy to deliver constitutional law lectures. His Oxford credentials combined with his demonstrated ability to educate rather than pontificate made him the most sought-after speaker on constitutional principles in the country. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the aftermath was professionally catastrophic. Fundraising dried up as even progressive donors distanced themselves from documented taxpayer abuse and constitutional ignorance. Speaking engagements were canceled. The media appearances that had built her career suddenly became unavailable as networks realized her credibility had been permanently damaged. More importantly, her own constituents began asking uncomfortable questions. If their representative was spending their tax dollars on dance lessons while they struggled with inflation, what did that say about her priorities? If she didn't understand the constitutional authority for the policies she promoted, how could they trust her to represent their interests? Primary challengers immediately emerged armed with Kennedy's constitutional education and documented evidence of AOC's financial irregularities. "We need real representation, not viral celebrity," became the theme of opponents who promised genuine public service over social media activism. The most lasting impact was cultural. Kennedy's masterful display of constitutional scholarship had reminded Americans that their system of government was designed by brilliant men who studied history, understood human nature, and created something exceptional. Suddenly, studying the Federalist Papers wasn't just for law students. Reading the Constitution wasn't just for lawyers. Understanding the philosophical foundations of American government became something regular citizens wanted to do. Kennedy had proven that constitutional knowledge wasn't elitist. It was essential. That genuine scholarship wasn't privilege. It was responsibility. That authentic public service wasn't about personal advancement. It was about defending principles larger than yourself. 1 month after the hearing that changed American politics. Senator Kennedy was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual Constitution Day celebration in Philadelphia. Standing where the founders had created the greatest system of government in human history, he delivered what many considered the most important constitutional education of his career. Today, we proved that the Constitution still works when someone has the courage to defend it. We showed that authentic scholarship can still defeat superficial activism. We demonstrated that genuine public service can still triumph over manufactured celebrity. His voice carried the moral authority of someone who'd spent his life studying and defending constitutional principles. The founders gave us a system that rewards wisdom over passion, knowledge over ignorance, and service over self-interest. Today, we proved that system still works when we have leaders worthy of it. Kennedy's closing words captured what had been accomplished. Representative Ocasio-Cortez came to attack privilege and found herself confronted with principle. She came to destroy tradition and discovered timeless wisdom. She came to promote change and encountered the unchanging truths that make America exceptional. This is what happens when constitutional scholarship meets social media activism. This is what happens when authentic public service confronts progressive privilege. This is what happens when America remembers what real leadership looks like. The crowd erupted in applause that lasted nearly 10 minutes. Americans celebrating not partisan victory, but the triumph of constitutional principles over radical ideology. Senator John Kennedy, the Rhodes Scholar from Louisiana, had reminded the country that the Constitution wasn't just a document, it was a covenant, and when that covenant was defended by someone who understood its wisdom, America always won. Hit that notification bell because when constitutional conservatives stand up to progressive radicals, America wins. This is what authentic public service looks like. God bless Senator Kennedy. God bless constitutional education. And God bless the United States of America.